Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and huge thank yous to everyone who watched, liked, and commented on my Trakina video, causing it to perform way better than I could have ever anticipated. So, I wanted to reward you all by jumping right into the next character video, or in this case characters, that you wanted to see most. We had a lot of comments asking for Ecliptor, Astronema, and Doggy Kruger specifically, with a smattering of others here and there. Kruger is a lot more complicated for some good and some not as good reasons, so he'll come later. And since it's nearly impossible to talk in depth about Ecliptor or Astronema separately, we're doubling down today because that just makes sense. So, setting the table here really gets at the core of why I think discussing these two characters, namely within their unique context in this franchise, is so fascinating. For years prior to In Space's premiere, PR focused on villains that were in many ways larger than life, framed as feeling above the Earth-based conflict they're in. Rita doesn't have a particularly good reason for wanting to conquer Earth. She's just a spoiled brat raised by a father in Master Vile who also holds massive amounts of galactic power. So, just like when we discussed Trakina, it would never occur to a character like her that conquering by any means necessary would be the wrong choice. It would never occur to her to reevaluate the pettiness she uses as the baseline for many of her anti-Ranger ploys. And it would certainly never occur to her to be introspective about those same matters when she ends up as the put-upon wife of a deadbeat husband she forced into marriage. Because if Astronema had won the day, and the Z-Wave never happened, resulting in her position among the universal baddies being less than ideal, as it was in Zeo, guess where she can go? Back home again. She's the Sharpay Evans of Power Rangers villains. Her whole shtick is that she never learns because she never actually has to in any definitive meaningful way. And while Divatox is somewhat less interesting by comparison, similar statements can be made regarding her as well. The difference being, she legitimately won, so there's a bit more of a main text reason as to why she can be both self-congratulatory and jealous of a newcomer that hasn't proven as much as she has. All this to say that Power Rangers as a conflict was built on the foundation that forces of evil you can't possibly hope to fully understand, let alone sympathize with, are perpetuating a seemingly endless war that you need to fight while keeping up appearances for the home front. So the one thing we do understand from that framing is that evil can be objectively determined. Culturally, it's not really a 90s point of view, in spite of MMPR being among the most quintessentially 90s shows. But that adds up, because it far more mirrors the Cold War perspective the adults writing and producing the show would have grown up with, but written for kids obviously. Which isn't to say it's as intentional or weaved in as when Transformers alludes to real-world warfare, but even franchise founder Haim Saban fought in 2 Israeli wars during the earlier parts of that same post-World War II time frame, and the military outfit he joined had that same prioritization on defense that Zordon did. So it's more likely than not that all of those combined perspectives on global conflict helped foster the darker than it gets credit for subtext of early Rangers. But as time marched on and ratings declined, the powers that be knew that they needed a major change in direction to keep the power alive. So what exactly does this part historical, part cultural, part high school musical analysis of MMPR's villains mean for Astronema? Well, we can see that aforementioned change highlighted through the notable tonal shift and the growing sense of serialization that defines In Space. But we also see that through the purposeful upending of what up until then defined villains and Rangers. This was made all the more effective due to Astronema and Ecliptor both beginning as thematically inseparable from their predecessors, even though they were far less comically inclined. Even with Elgar hanging around, he feels decidedly out of place alongside guys like Darkonda compared to when Divatox was the primary threat. But despite a tone that is somewhat harsher on the face of it, In Space is actually far more hopeful with its outlook. It was famously supposed to have been the final season, and because of that, the way it presents itself comes bearing the idea that outreach, empathy, and understanding can, at long last, bring an end to this conflict. To further explain that idea, let's dig more into the pair of characters in question, starting first with Ecliptor. Astronema's evil adoptive father presents a stark contrast to the father we discussed just a video prior. In the case of Scorpius, he functions as sort of a hybrid between the type of unshakably evil father that Zed became, albeit very retroactively, and the type of troubled but well-meaning father you see in Colonel Truman, for example. He won't compromise his philosophy, but he also isn't doing so out of conscious spite for his daughter, who he genuinely loves and wants the best for, in his own concerning ways. But we also understand the end result of his insistences, that being Trakeena's slow, painful, almost inevitable personal decline. The dynamic Ecliptor gave us just a year earlier is similar in the sense that his actions are primarily fueled by doing what he believes is necessary to protect Astronema, and part of that is neglecting to tell her the truth about her brother and her past more generally, a past his rival Darkonda helped set into motion for Dark Spectre. And since I'd assume pretty much all of you guys have seen In Space, we all know where the major divergence of these space daddies occurs. Ecliptor eventually comes to realize that his original mindset was incorrect, not by being convinced by Andros or any of our other heroes, and not because he always hated Darkonda for what he did, as he was complicit in that, but because he simply comes to regret it. He rightfully feels that Astronema's brush-ups with identity and the turmoil it's causing her is partly his fault. And he doesn't so much as bluntly express all that sentiment as much as he offers Astronema a choice that he doesn't think he has. But the beautiful irony there is not only does he have that same choice in spite of his hardwired programming, but it's a choice he already made by admitting to himself that Astronema having the possibility of choosing good is more valuable than anything he was forced to believe about evil. Ecliptor being a robot should, in theory, force him to abide by the standards set by the objectively evil Dark Spectre. But it doesn't. And from what we can gauge, it doesn't have anything to do with him malfunctioning. Although PR doesn't really take a hard, thoughtful stance on artificial intelligence as a concept, this is one subtle, if not incidental, example of one of their takes on it. This franchise usually treats robotic entities of all kinds as people, as individuals who are not seen as lacking humanity simply because they aren't biological, and it applies to the good robots as well as the evil ones. It would be so easy to be a touch more malicious about their defining traits, but that only happens when characters like Metal Alice, for example, essentially others herself. She then tries to convince Robo Knight to do the same and he refuses. And you can buy that because it's the antagonist side of the conflict prioritizing all the dehumanizing elements of robots, which runs contrary to the understated and underrated way the Megaforce protagonists approach the same idea. As such, our heroes are properly framed as in the right. All of this to say that I appreciate how Ecliptor's specific identity doesn't compromise his agency until it's very clear that Dark Spectre doesn't want any agency from anyone ever again. Hold on to that thought though, because we'll come back to it. So what all of this implies is that evil isn't this fixed, simplistic concept that can just be programmed in. It's not a road you have to stick to just because you were born walking on it, regardless of how justified Ecliptor used to feel his actions were. There is no way he was designed with the intention of introspection and feeling things, but because of Astronema, it just came to him. And that makes him far more empathetic than a lot of purely human antagonists ever could be. Isn't it funny how we laugh at Vrock for reveling in the complexity of machines, when not only was he right in the context of Megaforce, but the legacy of power also fully supports his stance? So now let's talk about Astronema herself, who towards the middle of the season initiates this rolling ball of introspection. The reason she works so well in tandem with Ecliptor is because he represents the agency of constructed evil, literally, while Astronema represents the more figurative idea of being built to take over the universe. Except it took time with her. It took Dark Spectre stealing a child from her home and raising her into the worst version of herself, and all the while trying to drain even the faintest remembrance of her childhood and positioning this form of villainy as, while mostly untested, inherently superior to the type of infighting and wackiness that defines pretty much every other villain he presides over. And it once again presents a familiar situation where Astronema wants to destroy the Rangers and reign as the Princess of Darkness for no real reason, other than that's what she was raised to fight for. But Zane, in his own clumsy, comical way, helps to reverse that damage. Dating the enemy because he's wildly attracted to her is a very Zane thing, make no mistake. But it also can't be denied that he made some real observable progress there. He knew the risks, but he still saw Astronema as someone who was worth a chance, worth getting to know, and worth love. And it's fitting that it's only him and Andros later on who firmly take this stance initially. They're the Ranger outsiders from our viewer perspective after all. Meanwhile, it's the Earth Rangers who we know best that come in with the inherent understanding that you absolutely should not trust evil. Because, as we discussed, up until that point, that would have 100% been the correct call. Divatox wasn't changing her ways for anyone, let alone rethinking them. And as crime fighters, that's pretty much half of TJ, Carlos, Ashley, and Cassie's perspective. So it makes perfect sense that the KO-35 boys were able to see something that the rest of the team couldn't, even for as generally trusting as someone like Ashley is. It won't take this bunch too much to eventually trust in you, but you do need to at least prove to them that you're making positive choices. And once Astronema does, she officially becomes crone to all of them. And that's the key thing here, really with this entire season. Because evil is able to be upended, given the chance and willingness, the only way to stop Astronema and Ecliptor from fully rejecting their upbringing is for Dark Spectre to strip them of choice. And what results is a now fully controlled Astronema relying on the Psycho Rangers, a group that also has no choice but to destroy their color-coded counterparts, even at the expense of themselves. It's Dark Spectre trying to basically rewrite the narrative, forcing this conflict to remain fully inside the confines of black and white. And nothing quite captures that desperate grab to reclaim control of the story more than We Are You, But Evil. Simple, straightforward, nothing to discuss or consider. We're here, we're bad, we're in your face, beat us or the narrative will never be yours again. Adapting the Neji Rangers in this way was, in my opinion, the best possible extension of everything Astronema and Ecliptor were going through during the back end of In Space. Crone's life became a tragedy after being kidnapped, but we also got a glimpse as to what her life could have been had she gotten the chance to be raised normally. And because of the choice made to save her, and subsequently reject the narrative hijacking Dark Spectre attempted, it isn't just the Space Rangers who are rewarded with a comrade, but the Galaxy Rangers as well. It's kind of neat to think about how Corone's initial actions in her second season came about through facing Trakina, because as we've discussed, both are remarkably similar in the way they were raised to be evil at the expense of what they could have been, and the second their agency starts rearing its head, it's taken away from them. Crone isn't just facing Trakina as a means of protecting the Quasar Saber. She's basically doing a practice run to facing her past more literally a few episodes later. Because even though Crone only knows so much about what Trakina has gone through, we the audience know both of their stories. So we know that where Trakina is now and where she's going is exactly where Crone used to be. The difference being that at their respective crossroads, Crone goes on the challenge and overcome her sense of remorse, and Trakina doubles down. It gets you to thinking that if Crone had been the one to attempt to sacrifice herself in Journey's End, it still would have made plenty of sense as a character moment, especially if they wrote it in the same brutal way that they wrote Maya's tie to Loyax, since Crone would then have to take a life already marred by the influence of a pain she fully understands, but had help subduing. But even minus that, it's impressive to me that the writers wrote up a really solid opening arc for her that fits almost too well with how she progressed to this point. Especially when you recall that the Galaxy Pink 2 role was originally written for Cassie, so they needed the quickest of turnarounds to make those next few episodes watchable, let alone good. And to now briefly discuss what I charitably call not my favorite Boom comic, the Psychopath had a really great chance to further capitalize on all of that. Putting aside the fact that Crone never thinks back to how Ecliptor changed as a means of raising her homicidal children, it's still a solid setup on paper. We know what Astronema did to people, and putting her in a situation where she has to face the Psychos as people and not as monsters is an interesting angle, especially when you also recall that in the context of this comic, said people were stripped of their agency by her, thus reminding her of a time when she was exactly what Dark Spectre envisioned. But all of it is bogged down by far too much nonsense and haphazard plot twists and far too little emotional commitment to its own proposed plot. But maybe they'll get it right next time now that Boom finally remembered Ecliptor exists. So the Crone story is far from fully explored, and I'm very cautiously optimistic about the new direction it's heading in. If nothing else, it certainly won't be worse than this, but that's a dumpster fire for another day. All in all, I think Astronema and Ecliptor are the greatest pair of villains in the franchise, not just because I have a great deal of fondness for empathetic villains, but because they embodied that in a way that intentionally changed what it meant to be an antagonist in this franchise. It's one of many things InSpace continually work towards through some of their best episodes. It's not quite the cleanest resolution to 6 years of stories, however. Ecliptor and the Machine Empire, the notably non-humanoid villains, turning to dust while Zed and Rita get to dance the invasion away, is just a mess of backwards implications. It almost reaches Beast Morphers levels of working against everything they got right for so long. Especially when you consider how Ecliptor was, once again, even through some more restrictive programming, thinking about protecting Astronema more than fighting for evil. But, that having been said, I do think that there is also one very important way that Countdown to Destruction does perfectly fit into that role. Putting aside the financial bump that allowed for the creation of Lost Galaxy and beyond for just a moment, the fight is over. The good guys won, but in a very specific way. Because the universe was changing, the nature of the conflict and those affected by it changing, and in realizing that, Zordon and the Rangers end up changing their old rules as well. It was time for those who stood strong alongside our protectors to finally see them for the people they were, as well as the Rangers. It was time to escalate and mercifully end the conflict while recognizing, albeit sloppily, that good could still exist inside even the most fiendish of foes. It was time to stop fighting and instead coexist with former enemies, maybe even align with them down the road, and go home. This story, this season, and these characters earned all of that. So, thanks again to everyone who supported my previous character video and suggested I take a closer look at these two fan favorites. And don't forget to throw down a comment with which character analysis you'd like to see next. Then hopefully I can get that out to you guys before Dino Fury premieres, presumably at some point in February, but we don't have an exact date as of me writing this. And until then, thanks for watching.